At 3 a.m., there was a loud, frantic knocking at my door that made my heart nearly leap out of my chest. When I opened it, I saw Ethan, the young neighbor from downstairs. His face pale, breathing fast, eyes wide with fear. "Miss Mary, you have to leave right now. They're coming at dawn," he said in panic. I froze, not understanding what was happening. I didn't yet know that my life and freedom were in the hands of the very people I trusted most. My name is Mary Collins. I'm 67 years old, and I live in Portland, Oregon. I never thought I'd see the day when I'd have to run away from the very home I spent my whole life building. Now, sitting in my small Portland apartment, looking out at the distant city lights, my heart still pounds whenever I remember that knock in the middle of the night. The knock that changed my life forever. I've always been an independent woman. My mother used to say, "A woman must stand on her own 2 feet." Maybe that's what kept me alive through my bitter divorce 13 years ago. George, my ex-husband, was the controlling type who always wanted things his way. When I was 54, after 25 years of marriage, I filed for divorce. Everyone said I was crazy, that a woman in her 50s, divorced and alone, couldn't take care of herself. But they were wrong. I had worked more than 30 years in the administrative department of a local accounting firm. I knew how to manage money and save wisely. When the marriage ended, I already had my own savings and one clear goal: to live free, dependent on no one. 3 years later, I bought a small apartment in downtown Portland, an old building from the 1950s, 2 bedrooms on the 6th floor, with a balcony overlooking the Willamette River. It was the first time I had ever felt truly proud of myself. My 3 children, Ryan, Paula, and Andrew, were a little unsure at first about this new version of their mother: confident, independent, no longer the self-sacrificing woman they once knew. But I was tired of being invisible in my own life. I wanted to live as Mary, not just as somebody's mom. He was 23 then, just moving into the 2nd floor, a polite, hard-working young man who worked for a delivery service around the city. From the first day, he greeted me with a bright smile and called me Miss Mary. Whenever he saw me carrying heavy bags, he insisted on helping. Ethan had lost his parents when he was little and had been raised by his grandmother. Maybe that's why he always had a special kindness toward older people. Over time, he became part of my daily life, watering my plants when I was away, picking up medicine when I was sick. I loved him like a son. My younger brother, Robert, was the complete opposite. He was 5 years younger and had been spoiled all his life. When our parents passed away 10 years ago, they left us the family house in Salem, Oregon. I sold my share to buy this apartment, while Robert burned through his inheritance on cars, alcohol, and meaningless parties. When the money was gone, Robert suddenly wanted to reconnect. Polite, caring, almost too nice. He said he missed me, wanted to rebuild our sibling bond. At first, I was genuinely happy. I thought time had matured him. He began visiting me every weekend, always complimenting my neat home, saying how charming the apartment was. One day, he told me that at my age, I should make a will so everything's in order. It sounded reasonable at 67. You never know what might happen. Robert even offered to take me to a lawyer he trusted. I naively thought that was brotherly care. I made my will, dividing everything equally among my 3 children. Following his suggestion, I added a clause naming him temporary financial guardian in case I became seriously ill or mentally incapacitated. At the time, I saw no harm in it. It seemed only practical since my kids lived far away and Robert was nearby, always acting attentive and kind. But recently, he started showing up more and more almost every day. He brought me brain vitamins, said I should get regular checkups, that he worried about me living alone. Then he began saying strange things that I was forgetful, repeating myself, losing focus. I felt perfectly fine, but he said it so often that I started to doubt myself. One day, Robert introduced me to a doctor he really trusted, Dr. Phillips, a psychiatrist specializing in elderly patients. He said it was just a preventive exam for peace of mind. I'm usually careful, so I agreed. But that appointment was odd. Doctor Phillips asked only a few simple questions, told me to draw a clock, then concluded that I had mild cognitive impairment and should be monitored long term. Leaving the clinic, I felt uneasy, but Robert looked pleased, saying, "Good thing we caught it early," and suggested that maybe I shouldn't live alone anymore, perhaps move somewhere with professional care. I refused. I was healthy, alert, cooking, reading, driving, living normally. But Robert began calling my children, telling them he was worried, that I was changing, forgetful, distracted. My kids, busy and far away, started to sound concerned. During our calls, they asked if I was taking my medication, eating properly, or feeling lonely. I noticed something in their voices, a mix of pity and doubt. Then, 2 months ago, Robert showed up with another doctor, Dr. Turner, who said he'd perform a full evaluation. This one was even stranger. He asked a few random questions, had me do simple math, then stepped out into the hallway to talk privately with Robert for a long time. When they came back, Dr. Turner said I had early-stage dementia and needed immediate special care. I stunned. I felt completely fine, but 2 doctors now said I was sick. I began to question myself, afraid that maybe I truly was losing my mind. Robert started coming by every day, looking worried, saying he couldn't let me live alone anymore. Then he began bringing papers for me to sign, saying they were just in case of hospitalization. I hesitated, but he insisted it was just paperwork. And with my mind clouded by confusion and fear after those medical diagnoses, I almost believed him. At that moment, Ethan, the young neighbor who lived downstairs, began to notice something strange. Later, he told me that he had seen Robert talking to a few unfamiliar men in the parking lot, and some cars had been idling outside the building for hours. But back then, I was trapped in fear, afraid that maybe I really was losing my mind, that everyone else was right. I started to believe Robert might truly be worried about me, until that fateful Tuesday night. The knocking came at 3 a.m., loud, urgent, like someone running from a terrible danger. I woke with a start, my heart pounding, my hands trembling. Through the peephole, I saw Ethan, but not the cheerful young man I usually knew. His face was white, his eyes wide, breathing hard as if he had just sprinted up 6 flights of stairs. I opened the door, and before I could say a word, he rushed inside, slammed it shut, and glanced down the hallway, as if someone might be watching. "Miss Mary, you have to go now. They'll be here by sunrise if you stay. It'll be too late," he said, voice shaking with fear. I stood frozen in my nightgown, unable to process what was happening. Ethan paced around the living room, running his hands through his hair, trying to catch his breath. I asked, "Who's coming? Why should I leave?" And then he told me the most terrifying truth of my life. That afternoon, Ethan had been delivering documents to a law office in downtown Portland, one of his regular delivery stops. Normally, he'd just drop the files at the front desk and leave, but the receptionist was out that day, so he had to take them straight to Attorney Matthews' office. As he approached the door, he heard voices from inside. One belonged to Mr. Matthews. The other, he recognized instantly, was Robert's. He was about to knock, but froze when he heard my name, Mary Collins, spoken in a cold, calculating tone that made his blood run cold. Ethan stood motionless in the hallway, listening, horrified. Robert and Matthews were discussing a plan they'd been preparing for months to file a petition declaring me legally incompetent, have me committed to a psychiatric facility, and gain full control over my assets. According to Ethan, Matthews already had a court order based on 2 falsified medical reports from Dr. Phillips and Dr. Turner, stating that I had severe dementia and was a danger to myself. All of it was fake paid for by Robert. When I heard that, my whole body went numb. Ethan went on. Early the next morning, a court officer would arrive with a state social worker and a doctor, carrying an official order declaring me mentally unfit and transferring me to Hillside Psychiatric Institute, a private facility outside Portland. For anyone who doesn't know, being declared legally incompetent means the court strips a person of all decision-making power, believing they can no longer understand reality. That person loses every legal right. They can't sign papers, sell property, or even make choices about their own life. A guardian is then appointed to control everything. In my case, that guardian would be Robert. He had arranged everything, a hospital room already booked, the property transfer papers completed, and his appointment as my legal guardian, giving him full authority over my assets. My apartment would be sold to cover medical expenses, and all the money would go straight into his hands. It was a perfect plan, cruel and coldly precise. My children, convinced by Robert that I needed special care, would sign the paperwork without question. Within weeks, I would become just another forgotten old woman, drugged into silence, obedient, powerless. Ethan said he was so shocked he nearly dropped the folder he was carrying. When the meeting ended, he ran downstairs, handed in the documents, and left the building without daring to look back. For the rest of the day, he couldn't stop thinking, should he tell me? At first, he worried he might be mistaken, or that maybe I truly needed help. But then he remembered all our conversations, how alert I always was, how I managed my life so carefully. When he later saw Robert arrive around 10 p.m., accompanied by 2 strange men, he knew he couldn't wait any longer. He waited until they left, around 2 a.m., then ran upstairs in the freezing night to knock on my door and save me. As Ethan spoke, I just sat there, tears streaming down my face. The person I trusted most, my own brother, had planned to steal everything I had and turn me into someone who truly appeared insane. Those doctors were frauds, and my children had been manipulated by his lies. I realized then that Robert's plan was flawless, every step calculated, making me doubt myself, forging medical proof, arranging a hospital, and legal paperwork. Ethan told me I had only a few hours left to act. Once the court officials arrived, there would be no way out. I'd lose all legal rights, unable to defend myself. I thought about calling my children for help, but Ethan stopped me. "Miss Mary, they won't believe you. They think you're delusional. We have to leave right now." He was right. Robert had convinced them I was severely ill. If I called in the middle of the night talking about a kidnapping plot and a mental hospital, they'd think I'd gone mad. Then, Ethan proposed something that sounded insane, but was my only chance. I had to leave my apartment before sunrise and hide until I could prove I was completely sane and expose Robert's conspiracy. He said he'd help me. He told me he knew a safe place to stay. The thought of leaving my own Portland home, the place I'd built my life in, surrounded by memories, broke my heart. I was 67, and every item, every photo, every habit in that apartment carried decades of meaning. How could I vanish like a fugitive? But then I pictured the alternative, locked inside a psychiatric ward, drugged, stripped of my rights, while Robert sold my apartment and spent every dollar. A chill ran down my spine. Ethan urged me to decide quickly. He said he knew a trustworthy lawyer, David Miller, who could help prove the medical records were fake, but only if I was still free, still capable, still myself. In that moment, something inside me awakened. The weak woman who had spent weeks doubting herself was gone. In her place stood Mary Collins, the woman who had survived a bitter divorce, rebuilt her life from nothing, and worked all her life to earn her independence. I looked at Ethan and told him he was right. I would not let Robert turn me into a helpless old lady, controlled like a puppet. If he wanted to fight, I would fight, and this time, through the law. Ethan smiled for the first time since arriving. He said he had always known I was stronger than I believed, that from the very first day we met, he knew I was resilient. His words reignited a fire inside me. We began to plan my escape. Ethan said he would take me to Mrs. Margaret's house, a 70-year-old woman who lived in the suburbs of Salem, Oregon, and often rented rooms to trustworthy people. It was a quiet, discreet place somewhere I could hide while gathering evidence. I packed only what I needed: a few documents, clothes, medicine, and all the cash I had left. As we quietly descended the fire escape at 5 a.m., I felt like I was leaving behind not just my apartment, but an entire lifetime of naivete and misplaced trust. From that moment on, I became someone new, a woman who understood that sometimes, to protect your dignity, you have to stand up against the very people you love most. Mrs. Margaret's house was on a calm little street, still holding the vintage charm of Oregon's old suburbs. When we arrived around 6 a.m., she greeted us with a calm face, wearing a soft robe, and didn't ask many questions. Ethan had called ahead, only saying that I needed a safe place for a few days. Mrs. Margaret was a small woman with bright, deep eyes that reflected wisdom and kindness. She looked me up and down, noticing the panic in my eyes, and gently said, "Come in, dear. I'll make some coffee, and you can tell me what happened." It was the first time in months I felt safe and understood. She arranged a small but tidy room for me, with a soft bed and a window overlooking a green garden. As soon as I sat down, I couldn't hold back anymore. I burst into tears, crying harder than I had in years. Every ounce of fear, pain, and betrayal poured out with those tears. Ethan stayed with me until I calmed down. He said he would return later that afternoon with attorney David Miller, who could help me. Before leaving, he warned me not to go outside, not to answer calls, not to talk to anyone. Ethan was certain Robert would soon realize I was gone and start searching. After Ethan left, Mrs. Margaret brought me a cup of coffee and a few slices of warm bread, then sat beside me in her cozy kitchen. She told me she had helped many people in similar situations. According to her, in America, it's sadly common for relatives to exploit the elderly, to seize their assets. She explained how these rings operate, involving corrupt doctors and lawyers who forge fake records to get a court order declaring the victim legally incompetent. They're paid handsomely, but for greedy people, it's just a small investment in exchange for a fortune. The most terrifying part, she said, was that victims are often injected with strong psychiatric drugs, making them truly confused and unstable. So no one believes them afterward. While we were talking, my phone kept ringing. It was Robert. He must have already discovered I was gone. Mrs. Margaret insisted I not answer, warning that anything I said could later be used against me. Around noon, Ethan called again. He said he had passed by my apartment building and saw police cars and an ambulance parked out front. After talking to the doorman, he learned they were carrying a court order looking for me to take me in for evaluation. My heart nearly stopped. It was all real. If I had still been home, I'd already be locked in a psychiatric hospital, drugged, stripped of my freedom. The thought made me shiver. Ethan had saved my life. Not just my life, but my dignity and freedom. That afternoon, I sat in silence, trying to understand it all. How could Robert have become so cruel? The brother I once protected, shared meals with, now wanted to destroy me. How did he sleep at night while plotting to steal his own sister's life and home? Then Mrs. Margaret said something I'll never forget. "Sweetheart." Thinking back, Robert had always been selfish, demanding, convinced the world owed him something. Around 5 p.m., Ethan returned with attorney David Miller, a man in his 50s, serious looking but with kind eyes. He shook my hand and sat down to listen. I told him everything: Robert's visits, the strange medical appointments, the absurd diagnoses. Mr. Miller said this was a textbook case of fabricated legal incompetence. He had handled similar cases before and believed we had a strong chance to overturn it. But we had to act quickly and strategically. The first step, he said, was for me to be reevaluated by trustworthy doctors he personally knew to prove that I was completely sane. He also arranged for me to undergo a full psychological assessment to confirm my cognitive and decision-making abilities. Miller warned that Robert had likely already filed a search and detain petition that day, claiming I was mentally ill and missing, a common tactic used to make victims appear unstable and justify forced institutionalization. Then he told me something even more shocking. He had checked the notary records and discovered that 2 weeks earlier, Robert had tried to change my will. He had lied, saying I was mentally unwell and wanted to update a few clauses. Thankfully, the notary required my personal presence, so he couldn't complete it. But that proved his scheme ran deeper than I ever imagined. He didn't just want me locked away. He wanted everything I owned. Mr. Miller confirmed that we would file a motion to overturn the legal incompetency ruling, press charges for forgery and fraud, and sue Robert along with the 2 doctors for falsifying medical records. It would be a tough legal battle, but he believed we could win. That night, I lay in the small room at Mrs. Margaret's house, thinking about everything that had happened in less than 24 hours. Just the morning before, I had been a confused woman, doubting myself, believing maybe I truly was sick. But now I knew I was the victim of a cruel scheme orchestrated by my own flesh and blood. The anger inside me didn't explode. It was cold, sharp. Robert had completely underestimated me. He thought I was a frail old woman, easy to manipulate, but he was about to learn that I was not someone who surrendered easily. At that moment, Mrs. Margaret knocked softly and came in, holding a cup of warm chamomile tea. She sat on the edge of the bed and said gently, "You're lucky, dear, you found out in time. I've seen many who didn't realize it until they'd been locked up for months, drugged, and no one believed them anymore." I asked how she managed to help people like that. She told me she had almost been a victim herself. Her own son once tried to have her committed to a psychiatric hospital to take her house. From then on, she decided to use her painful experience to help other elderly people in similar situations. In that moment, I realized I wasn't alone. There were still good people in the world, people like Ethan and Mrs. Margaret who truly cared, and people like attorney David Miller, who had dedicated his career to fighting injustice and protecting what's right. The next morning, our counterattack began. Mr. Miller arranged 3 independent evaluations, one by a neurologist, one by a psychiatrist, and one by a psychologist. All were respected professionals who would assess and confirm my mental capacity. The first was Dr. Alan Ferguson, a leading neurologist in Portland. He ran a full set of tests, CT scans, MRIs, and comprehensive cognitive assessments. Throughout the exam, he kept commenting on how alert I was, how sharp my reasoning and orientation were. After hearing my story, he was furious, calling cases like mine a stain on the medical field and saying that doctors who sell fake diagnoses deserve to lose their licenses. He even volunteered to testify for me in court. The second appointment was with Dr. Michael Harris, a psychiatrist. He spent nearly 3 hours speaking with me, testing my psychological and emotional state. His conclusion was clear. I've never seen a 67-year-old woman with mental health this strong. Finally, I met Dr. Susan Baker, a psychologist who conducted advanced tests on personality, memory, judgment, and spatial temporal orientation. My results were exceptional in every category. Dr. Baker said I not only had perfect cognition, but also extraordinary emotional strength, a kind of resilience she rarely saw in anyone my age. With those 3 reports in hand, Mr. Miller immediately filed an emergency motion in the Oregon court to overturn the incompetency ruling. He attached the new medical records along with a detailed report outlining the falsifications in the old ones. But Robert didn't sit still. 2 days later, Ethan told me that Robert was spreading rumors all over the neighborhood claiming I had lost my mind, become paranoid, and run away from home. He even said I was dangerous, delusional, and that anyone who saw me should call the police. When I heard that, I decided to do something even Mr. Miller didn't expect. I wanted to record a video proving I was completely sane, fully aware, and understood everything. I wanted to make sure that if anything happened, there would be evidence that I wasn't some senile old woman on the run. Brilliant idea. We recorded a 15-minute video in which I told my entire story, showed the authentic medical evaluations, and explained Robert's conspiracy in detail. It became my official testimony, stored safely and submitted to the legal authorities. That night, as I lay down, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. I was no longer the woman who doubted herself. I was a 67-year-old woman fighting for justice, surrounded by good people, lawyers, doctors, and friends who stood by my side. The battle had only begun, but for the first time, I truly believed I could win. Robert had chosen the wrong woman to mess with. 1 week after I fled my home, I received a phone call that completely changed the direction of the case. It was Mr. Miller, and his voice was full of excitement. Something I had never heard from him before. He said he had found the evidence that could turn everything around. A copy of security footage from the law office where Robert and Attorney Matthews had plotted my so-called incompetency case. The building had an internal camera system, and thanks to his connections in the Oregon District Attorney's office, Mr. Miller obtained the footage from the same day Ethan had overheard their conversation. When he showed it to me, my blood boiled. In the video, Robert was sitting comfortably in a leather chair, laughing, gesturing toward the documents as he discussed the plan to steal my assets. There wasn't a trace of worry or regret, only cold greed and calculated cruelty. The footage clearly showed Robert handing Attorney Matthews a thick envelope, clearly a payoff for their crime. They discussed exactly how long I would be kept in the hospital, how they would split the money from selling my apartment, and how they would convince my children that everything was for their mother's own good. But the part that made my skin crawl was hearing Robert himself say that I was too stubborn, independent, and needed to be broken down mentally before being admitted. He even suggested the doctors use strong medication to make me compliant and easy to control. Those words coming from my only brother felt like listening to someone describe how to tame an animal, not how to treat a human being. Attorney David Miller said that with this footage, my case now had undeniable evidence. It was no longer my word against his. We had proof of collusion, falsified medical records, and professional bribery. Then he told me something that left me frozen. Through his investigation, he discovered that I wasn't Robert's first victim. He had used the same method on 2 other elderly people over the past 3 years. A 74-year-old woman who had died inside the psychiatric hospital where she was held, and a 69-year-old man who was still alive but bedridden, drugged, and abandoned by his family. Mr. Miller showed me all the documents and evidence, confirming it. In both cases, Robert had presented himself as a voluntary guardian, then used the same two corrupt doctors to forge medical files, declaring the victims legally incompetent. Afterward, he sold their homes and took all the money. He was a professional predator, exploiting the trust of the elderly. Realizing that my own brother was, in fact, a serial con artist made me feel sick to my stomach and sent chills down my spine. I thought about the people he had destroyed, the broken families, the elders locked away and forgotten. I thought about that woman who had died alone in the hospital, with no one to believe her, and about the 69-year-old man still alive but so heavily drugged that he no longer knew who he was, living like a shadow. At that moment, I understood that my fight was no longer just about reclaiming my freedom or my assets. It was about seeking justice, stopping Robert from ruining more lives, speaking for those who could no longer defend themselves. Mr. Miller explained that with this new evidence, my case had now become a criminal case, not just a civil dispute. Robert could now be investigated for fraud, forgery, criminal conspiracy, and even involuntary manslaughter, since that woman had died from an overdose at the hospital. 2 days later, an unexpected visitor came to Mrs. Margaret's house, my daughter, Paula. She had driven more than 3 hours from Seattle to see me. When I opened the door and saw her tear-streaked face, my heart tightened. Paula hugged me tightly, a hug I had longed for years. She told me that Robert had called her and her 2 brothers, saying I had gone insane, become paranoid, and run away from home, and that they needed to find me urgently to get me treatment. At first, all 3 believed him. But Paula, my most sensitive and perceptive child, started to doubt. She decided to investigate on her own. Paula spoke to neighbors, the building's doorman, and a few acquaintances of mine. All confirmed that I had been perfectly normal and lucid, showing no signs of illness. It was Ethan who eventually told Paula where I was. When she went to the apartment building asking around, Ethan recognized her as my daughter and, after getting my permission, told her everything. That's how Paula learned the horrifying truth. She cried, saying she felt guilty for believing Robert, for not realizing her mother was being deceived. She said she should have been suspicious earlier, especially when Robert kept calling to talk about my mental health. Paula also told me she had spoken to her brothers, Ryan and Andrew. They admitted that they had signed documents Robert gave them because he sounded so convincing he had medical records and the sweet words of a concerned younger brother. Then, Paula said something that brought tears to my eyes. She told me she was proud of me, proud that I had the courage to escape and stand up for justice. She said she now understood where her own strength and determination came from. It was Paula who came up with the idea to change our approach. She suggested holding a family meeting, inviting both her brothers to confront the truth and unite in support of me. If my children stood by me publicly, Robert could no longer pretend he was just protecting his sick sister. The meeting took place that weekend at Mrs. Margaret's house. Ryan and Andrew drove from Salem to attend. When I told them, everything showed them the video, the real medical evaluations, and the evidence of the plot, I saw anger and disbelief ignite in all 3 of my children's eyes. Ryan, always the hot-tempered one. Meanwhile, Paula had already started organizing a social media awareness campaign to warn others about scams targeting the elderly. During that meeting, we made a decision that remains one of the proudest moments of my life. My children didn't just support me, they became my allies in this fight. They volunteered to testify, help fund legal expenses, and do whatever it took to expose Robert. Mr. Miller said that with my children's backing, our case was now nearly unbeatable. Robert could no longer claim in court that he was caring for a sister abandoned by her kids because my children would be there, in person, to testify that their mother was completely sane and unjustly targeted. But Robert wasn't going down without a fight. A week after the meeting, he pulled a shameless stunt. He drove all the way to Paula's house in Seattle, pretending to be worried about me, saying I was being manipulated by dangerous people. Paula said he even cried, putting on a pathetic performance, claiming it broke his heart to see his sister lost and deceived. He tried to convince her that Attorney Miller was a con man, that Ethan was some scammer taking advantage of my mental confusion. But Paula didn't fall for it. She secretly recorded the entire conversation. When we listened to that recording, everyone shivered. Robert's voice was cold and calculating, speaking like a master manipulator, twisting emotions, distorting facts, planting doubt as if it was something he'd practiced his whole life. The scariest part was how sincere he sounded, as if he truly believed his own lies, convinced he was somehow saving me from myself. Mr. Miller explained that this was a classic trait of offenders like him. They build elaborate stories to justify their crimes, repeating their lies so often that they start to believe them as truth. And then, right at that moment, I received a phone call that shattered my heart. It was from the daughter of the 69-year-old man, the victim who was still alive, but trapped in the institution because of Robert. She had learned about my case through the Oregon police investigation, and I wanted to meet me in person. When we met at Mrs. Margaret's house, I saw before me a woman around 45, completely exhausted and broken. She told me her father had been a clear-minded, independent man, a retired high school teacher, until he was suddenly forced onto heavy medication and locked in a private psychiatric facility in Portland. She didn't understand what was happening. She thought her father truly was ill. It wasn't until she heard about our investigation that she discovered her father had fallen victim to the same scheme Robert had used on me. She said she had tried to visit him, but he'd been injected with such strong drugs that he no longer recognized his own daughter. The doctors told her he was in the final stages of dementia, beyond saving. I held her hand and promised that we would do everything possible to free her father and bring those responsible to justice. At that moment, I realized my story had grown beyond myself. That night, lying on the small bed in Mrs. Margaret's house, staring at the ceiling, I felt a determination stronger than ever before. Robert had underestimated not only my strength, but the strength of justice when good people stand together for what is right. The trial began 4 months after the night I fled my home. When I walked into the courtroom in Portland, dressed in a dark blue suit, hair neatly combed, head held high, I knew I was no longer the frightened woman who once ran into the night. I was a woman who had found herself again stronger and more confident than ever. Robert sat at the defendant's table beside Attorney Matthews and the 2 doctors who had signed the fake diagnoses. When our eyes met, he immediately looked down. He couldn't face me. The man who had so coldly plotted to destroy my life now looked small and pathetic. Attorney Miller had built a solid case. The office video, the real medical reports proving I was completely sane, testimonies from other flashed, victims, and bank records showing Robert had paid the doctors for falsified files. But the most moving moment came when Ethan took the stand as a witness. The young man who had risked everything to save me that night stood tall, calm, steady, and brave. He described how he discovered the plot, how he knocked on my door in the middle of the night, and how he helped me escape. When the defense attorney tried to imply that Ethan was lying or had ulterior motives to steal my property, I felt my blood boil. But Ethan answered with one sentence that silenced the entire courtroom. "Sir, if I wanted to take advantage of Mrs. Mary, I wouldn't have warned her. I could have stayed quiet, let it happen, and later pretended to be the kind neighbor visiting her in the hospital to earn her trust." That answer moved everyone. Even the judge smiled faintly. Robert's lawyer had nothing left to say. Then my 3 children took the stand, one after another. They told the court how Robert Limes had manipulated them, making them believe their mother had lost her mind. Paula, my daughter, spoke with a trembling but determined voice, saying she felt ashamed for ever doubting me, and that now she understood how people like Robert use family love as a weapon. The testimony that brought the courtroom to tears came from the woman whose father had survived Robert's abuse. She had petitioned to have her father released and brought him to court. Seeing that 69-year-old man, still trembling from medication, describing how he'd lost his entire life to unlawful confinement, it left the entire room in stunned silence. When it was my turn to speak, I had rehearsed what to say, but as I looked around the packed courtroom, the words came straight from my heart. I spoke about the months of mental manipulation, how Robert had used family ties to make me doubt myself, how he had carefully built his plan to have me institutionalized. Then I spoke about the night Ethan knocked on my door, the night that changed my life forever. Not just because it saved me from being locked away, but because it restored my faith in goodness, in the fact that there are still people willing to risk themselves to protect the innocent. I looked directly at Robert and said, "My brother thought he was dealing with a helpless old woman, but he forgot that this same woman raised 3 children alone after divorce, worked for 30 years to buy her own home, and rebuilt her entire life at 54. He completely misjudged who I am," Robert's attorney countered, asking if I regretted taking my own brother to court, if I ever thought maybe he was just worried about me. I replied, "The only thing I regret is not seeing his true nature sooner." When he pressed further, asking, "Isn't family supposed to be sacred?" I answered a response that made the entire courtroom fall silent. A sacred family protects. It doesn't destroy. A sacred family respects. It doesn't steal. Ethan, who doesn't share a drop of my blood, has been more of a family to me than my own brother ever was. Finally, attorney David Miller delivered a deeply moving closing statement. He said that this type of crime was becoming increasingly common in the United States, crimes that preyed on the vulnerability and prejudice faced by the elderly. He stated that my case could stand as proof that older people are not weak, that they can fight and they can win. The prosecutor also spoke with great conviction. He said that crimes against the elderly were among the cruelest of all because they targeted those most deserving of love and protection. He urged the court to impose the maximum sentence on everyone involved, emphasizing that Robert had turned family love into a weapon for crime. 2 weeks later, the official verdict was announced. Robert was sentenced to 8 years in prison for fraud, forgery, and criminal conspiracy. Attorney Matthews received 6 years. The 2 doctors who had signed the fake medical reports were not only sentenced to prison, but also had their medical licenses permanently revoked. 1 month after the trial, I finally returned to my apartment in Portland. Ethan had taken care of everything while I was away watering the plants, cleaning, keeping everything exactly as I had left it. When I opened the door and saw my familiar home, I burst into tears. But this time, they were tears of relief, gratitude, and new beginnings. I had lost a brother, but I had gained a real family. Ethan was still the kind young neighbor, but now he was also the son life had gifted me. Mrs. Margaret had become a dear friend, a confidant, while Attorney Miller was like a mentor, a companion in the fight for justice and dignity for the elderly. After everything, my children grew closer to me. They realized how wrong they had been seeing me, only as someone who needed protection, not as a woman strong. enough to stand up and fight for herself. Paula once told me something I will never forget. Mom, I've always admired your strength, but now I see it's far greater than I ever imagined. You've taught me that it's never too late to stand up for your own rights. Today, months after that fateful night, I can say that I am truly happy not because I regained my property or saw justice served, but because I found myself again. I learned that age does not mean weakness. Being 67 doesn't mean accepting disrespect. Being elderly doesn't mean being powerless. I learned to trust my own strength, my wisdom, and my ability to decide my future. Ethan is now dating a wonderful woman named Carla. They asked me to be the godmother at their wedding, an honor that moved me to tears. As for Robert, he's serving his sentence in prison. I received a letter from him once, apologizing and claiming he was blinded by greed. I never replied. Some wounds run too deep to be healed by words. But I learned not to let hatred take over my heart. I didn't forgive what he did, but I refused to let anger destroy the peace I fought so hard to reclaim. I chose gratitude. Gratitude for the good people I met, for the strength I found within myself, and for the lives we helped save. Every morning, I look out my window and see Portland awakening in the sunlight, and I silently thank God for giving me the courage to fight. Thank you for that night, Ethan, when you knocked on my door. Thank you for reminding me that it's never too late to begin again. If you're reading this story, maybe it's because you needed to hear this. It's never too late to stand up for your rights. A real family protects you, they don't destroy you. And age will never determine your ability to take control of your own life. Now, when someone asks me where I found the strength to overcome everything, I simply smile and say, that strength was always within me. I just needed one knock on the door in the middle of the night to find it. And if one day you find yourself in a situation like mine, remember the story of Mary Collins, the 67-year-old woman who almost lost everything to her own brother, but found her greatest strength in her weakest moment. Never let anyone convince you that you are powerless. Never accept being diminished because of your age. Never stop fighting for your dignity. And most importantly, remember that real family lifts you up, not pushes you down. My life began again at 67 on the very night when an angel in a delivery uniform knocked on my door and shouted, "Run, ma'am, before it's too late." The story you've just heard is a work of fiction inspired by real events. Names and settings have been changed to protect identities, but the emotions, the fear, the betrayal, the courage, and the love are very real. Many elderly people have faced something similar, being doubted, manipulated, or silenced by those closest to them. And so, one question remains. If it were you, would you stay silent? Or would you stand up and speak the truth, even if it meant confronting those you love most? Whatever you choose, believe this God always sees the honesty in your heart, and He blesses those who dare to live in the light of justice and love. Thank you for listening. Stay until the end to watch 2 videos. I believe you'll love stories that touch the heart, about faith, kindness, and the strength of the human spirit.